This is the protest happened in Hong Kong in 2019. About 2 million of Hong Kongers joined the protest against the 2019 Hong Kong extradition bill. This represented nearly 30% of Hong Kong's population. By the end of the protests, over 10,000 people were arrested between June 2019 and early 2021, according to official figures. After 5 years, today, in 2024, what is the latest development in Hong Kong? Is Hong Kong getting better or worse? Before we explore more, let us recall a little history of Hong Kong. Back to early of 19th century, British traders profited immensely from selling opium to China. Despite its prohibition by the Qing government, this trade imbalance led to tensions, culminating in the First Opium War during 1839 to 1842. The British Navy's superior military power forced China into defeat. Under the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, China ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. This marked the beginning of British rule. Following further trade disputes, the Second Opium War led to more British gains. In 1860, under the Convention of Peking, China ceded the southern part of the Kowloon Peninsula and Stonecutters Island to Britain. This expansion solidified Hong Kong's role as a strategic port for trade and military purposes. As Hong Kong's population and trade importance grew, Britain sought more land to sustain its colony. In 1898, under the Second Convention of Peking, China leased the new territories, comprising additional mainland land in 235 islands, to Britain for 99 years. This lease was set to expire on June 30, 1997, laying the groundwork for future negotiations about Hong Kong's sovereignty. Fast forward to 1980s, Hong Kong was firmly established as a global economic powerhouse and one of the most important trading hubs in Asia. As the 1997 expiration date for the new territories lease approached, discussions about Hong Kong's future began. Returning only the leased territories while retaining Hong Kong Island and Kowloon was deemed impractical, as the regions were economically and infrastructurally interdependent. In 1984, Britain and China signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration, agreeing that Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty on July 1, 1997 under the principle of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would retain its capitalist system, legal framework, and freedoms for 50 years, until 2047. China pledged to preserve Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy.
The British flag will be lowered, and British administrative responsibility will end.
On June 30, 1997, British Governor Chris Patten oversaw a ceremonial handover of Hong Kong to China. The British flag was lowered, and the Chinese flag was raised in a symbolic moment witnessed globally. Prince Charles represented Britain at the ceremony, while Chinese President Jiang Zemin welcomed the return of Hong Kong. British administration laid the foundations for Hong Kong's modern identity, with robust institutions, infrastructure, and its status as a global financial hub. However, the colonial era also had its challenges, including social inequality and the lack of local political participation. The peaceful transfer to China marked the end of British colonial rule in Asia and began a new chapter for Hong Kong under Chinese sovereignty, albeit with ongoing debates about the preservation of its freedoms and autonomy. Since Hong Kong returned to China, Hong Kong has experienced several major demonstrations against its government, often reflecting public concerns about freedoms, governance, and Beijing's increasing influence. These demonstrations happened in 2003, 2012, and 2014 before introducing the extradition bill in 2019. In 2003, protest against Article 23. In 2012, anti-national education protests. And in 2014, the Umbrella Movement. In February 2018, Chan Tong-kai, a Hong Kong citizen, traveled to Taiwan with his girlfriend, Poon Hiu-wing. While in Taiwan, Chan murdered Poon, reportedly after an argument, and returned to Hong Kong, leaving her body behind. In Hong Kong, Authorities could only charge Chan with money laundering for using Poon's bank cards and possessions, as the city lacked an extradition agreement with Taiwan to prosecute him for murder. Hong Kong's existing laws did not allow extradition to jurisdictions with which it had no formal treaty, including Taiwan and mainland China. Chan's case was cited by the Hong Kong government as an example of why this legal gap needed to be closed. In early 2019, the Hong Kong government introduced amendments to the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance to allow case-by-case extraditions to jurisdictions with no formal agreements, including mainland China, Taiwan, and Macau. The government argued this would ensure justice for cases like Chan's while strengthening Hong Kong's legal framework. The bill sparked widespread fear that it would erode Hong Kong's judicial independence and expose residents, activists, and foreign nationals to the opaque legal system of mainland China, where the judiciary is seen as heavily influenced by the Communist Party.
It's not initiated by the Central People's Government. I have not received any instruction or mandate from Beijing to do this bill. We were doing it, and we are still doing it, out of our clear conscience and our commitment to Hong Kong. We want Hong Kong to fare well. So there must be over 170 other jurisdictions that we have no legal basis to entertain a request for the return of a fugitive offender, somebody who has committed a very serious crime in that particular jurisdiction, but has fled to Hong Kong, and we can't do anything about it.
In March 2019, small protests began against the bill. By June, they had escalated into massive demonstrations, with millions taking to the streets. Protesters demanded the withdrawal of the bill, with many fearing that the legislation would enable Beijing to target political dissidents. Police responses, including tear gas and arrests, intensified public anger. The protests evolved into broader demands, including universal suffrage and an independent inquiry into police conduct. On September 4, 2019, Carrie Lam announced the formal withdrawal of the bill.
First, the government will formally withdraw the bill in order to fully allay public concerns.
However, by then, the protests had grown into a pro-democracy movement addressing broader grievances about Hong Kong's governance and autonomy. Chan was released in October 2019 after serving 18 months in prison for money laundering. He expressed willingness to surrender to Taiwanese authorities to face trial for murder.
對唔住，希望各位嘅原諒，希望各位可以俾機會我重新做人，俾個機會我報告社會。
However, Taiwan and Hong Kong authorities became embroiled in a political standoff. Taiwan rejected Chan's voluntary surrender, insisting that a formal extradition agreement was necessary. Hong Kong argued that Taiwan was politicizing the case, and Chan remains in Hong Kong as of 2024. Chan Tongkai's case highlighted the complexities of cross-jurisdictional legal arrangements in Hong Kong. While it served as the catalyst for the extradition bill, the resulting protests fundamentally reshaped Hong Kong's political landscape and led to Beijing implementing the national security law in 2020, further tightening its control over the city. In June 2020, Beijing bypassed Hong Kong's legislature to impose the national security law. The law criminalized acts of secession, subversion, terrorism and collusion with foreign forces. The national security law granted mainland authorities significant power to enforce the law in Hong Kong and allowed trials to take place in mainland China under certain conditions. The Chinese government described the national security law as necessary to restore stability and prevent foreign interference in Hong Kong. Officials argued that the 2019 protests, which had sometimes turned violent, threatened national security.
The purpose of this piece of legislation is not just to punish, it is also to deter people from committing such serious offenses as secession, subverting the state power, terrorist activities, and so on and so on. So deterrence is very important. Now, criticism, it comes under freedom of speech. There is a specific reference in the principle of this piece of law under the General Principles, Chapter 1, Article 4, which provides for the Hong Kong SAR to safeguard national security, which should also safeguard human rights and so on. Or some of these human rights enjoyed by individuals under the international covenants are not absolute, as the covenant provisions specify. Where it is for the protection of national security, then sometimes some of these rights could be restrained in accordance with the law. Now, but it is clearly stated in Article 4 that people of Hong Kong, they should be able to continue to enjoy the freedom of speech, freedom of press, of publications, protests, assembly, and so on and so on.
In Hong Kong, the two main political ideological blocs are pro-establishment camp and pan-democracy camp. The pro-establishment camp in Hong Kong refers to the political alliance that supports the central government in Beijing and aligns closely with the Hong Kong government. This camp emphasizes stability, economic development, and maintaining a cooperative relationship with the Chinese government. It generally opposes the pan-democracy camp and its push for democratic reforms that challenge Beijing's influence. Major parties and groups in the pro-establishment camp are Democratic Alliance for the Betterment and Progress of Hong Kong, DAB, Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions, FTU, Business and Professionals Alliance for Hong Kong, BPA, Liberal Party and New People's Party, NPP. The pan-democracy camp in Hong Kong refers to a political alliance of individuals and parties advocating for democracy, civil liberties, and greater political freedoms in the region. This camp is characterized by its support for universal suffrage, the protection of the one country, two systems framework, and resistance to perceived encroachments on Hong Kong's autonomy by the central government in Beijing. The pan-democrats are often in opposition to the pro-establishment camp, which aligns with Beijing and the Hong Kong government. The major parties and groups historically affiliated with the pan-democracy camp are Democratic Party, Civic Party, Labour Party, League of Social Democrats, LSD, People Power and Demazisto. Now, let's look at the electoral system in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's electoral system is composed of three types of constituencies that elect members to the Legislative Council, LegCo, reflecting a hybrid of direct and indirect election methods. These constituencies are the geographical constituencies, GCs, functional constituencies, FCs, and the election committee constituency, ECC. Geographical constituencies is directly elected by Hong Kong residents through universal suffrage. Functional constituencies represent specific sectors or professional groups, for example business, education, legal and medical. Election committee constituency was first introduced during the British colonial era for the 1995 Legislative Council elections, designed as one of the three sectors outlined in the Basic Law of Hong Kong, alongside geographical constituencies, GCs, and functional constituencies, FCs. After the 1997 handover, the ECC was reintroduced for the 1998 LegCo election under a different structure. The ECC was entirely removed in the 2004 LegCo election, and its seats were replaced by directly elected geographical constituency seats. The ECC was reintroduced as part of the 2021 electoral reforms following the 2019 protests and the enactment of the National Security Law. The ECC's expansion aimed to solidify Beijing's control over Hong Kong's governance, ensuring a majority of LegCo members are indirectly elected by a controlled body rather than through direct public elections. Legislative Council complex play a crucial role in legislative process in Hong Kong. However, it also becomes the site of anti-extradition bill protests in 2019. On July 1, 2019, among hundreds of thousands of demonstrators, a more radical group of protesters gathered near the Legislative Council complex. By the evening, protesters breached the complex and entered the main chamber. Inside, they spray-painted slogans on the walls, defaced the Hong Kong emblem, and displayed banners calling for universal suffrage and the withdrawal of the extradition bill. The chamber became a visual tableau of their anger, with messages denouncing Beijing and demanding greater autonomy. Police did not intervene immediately, opting to retake the building later in the night after protesters had voluntarily withdrawn. This restraint was interpreted by some as a tactical decision to avoid escalating the situation on a highly symbolic day. The Hong Kong government and Chinese officials condemned the incident as an attack on the rule of law. After the handover, Hong Kong became a special administrative region, SAR, of China, governed under the one country, two systems framework and the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini-constitution. The Basic Law promised a high degree of autonomy and stated that the ultimate aim was the election of the chief executive and all members of LegCo by universal suffrage. However, the timeline was left vague. The post-handover electoral system maintained a mix of directly elected seats and functional constituencies for LegCo, ensuring that Beijing-friendly elites retained significant influence. The chief executive was selected by an election committee, a body heavily dominated by pro-Beijing members. The election committee initially had 400 members, later expanded to 1,200, representing professional sectors, political groups, and Beijing-appointed figures. Ordinary citizens had no role in electing the chief executive. Half of LegCo seats were directly elected by the public, and the other half were elected by functional constituencies. favoring pro-Beijing interests. All electoral reforms required approval from Beijing, which repeatedly delayed or diluted democratic progress. In March 2021, Beijing imposed sweeping changes to Hong Kong's electoral system under the guise of ensuring patriots govern Hong Kong. The election committee was expanded to 1,500 members, further dominated by pro-Beijing figures. The committee now plays a direct role in nominating and electing LegCo members. The proportion of directly elected LegCo seats was drastically reduced. 35 out of 70 seats were directly elected previously. Only 20 out of 90 seats are directly elected in post-2021. A candidate eligibility review committee, controlled by Beijing, was established to vet all candidates, ensuring only patriots, pro-Beijing individuals, can stand for election. The 2021 reforms further consolidated Beijing's control over the chief executive selection process. The expanded election committee retains exclusive rights to nominate and elect the chief executive, with even stricter vetting mechanisms. Some people doubt why Hong Kongers are so passionate on the freedom and the democracy system. They question the Hong Kong or not even get full democracy under the British. These people are correct. Hong Kong was never a fully democratic region under British colonial rule. The British colonial administration retained significant control over the governance of Hong Kong, and it was only toward the final years of British rule that limited democratic reforms were introduced. While Hong Kong was not a democratic region under British rule, its high level of autonomy, freedoms, and legal protections created a governance model admired globally. These freedoms made it a role model not for democracy per se, but for liberal governance, transparency, and economic vitality. The British only began to grant Hong Kong limited democratic rights in the final years of colonial rule. Critics argue that these reforms were primarily intended to ensure that China could not completely roll back Hong Kong's liberal governance after the 1997 handover. By the time of the handover, Hong Kong was left with an incomplete democratic system, one that became a source of tension between its citizens' aspirations for full democracy and Beijing's control. With the rising power of China and its influence globally, Western, especially US, worried the competition from China. Under the one country, two systems, Beijing reiterates that China will go on its way without disturbance from the foreign powers. If Chinese government do not stop the movement on independence of Hong Kong, it will create more troubles in controlling the whole China. Ahead of the 25th anniversary of Hong Kong's handover from Britain to China in 2022, Hong Kong's former chief executive, Leung Chun-ing, said this to the AFP-TV.
People wanted universal suffrage. That's true, but must be in the context of one country, two systems. Must take into account the powers of the central authorities. Must not confuse Hong Kong's democratic process with, let's say, Singapore's, because we are not a sovereign state. Now, these were better understood in those days than in recent years, before we became misled by people like Penny Tai, by the occupiers in Central, and by people like Jimmy Lai, who basically wanted to cast aside the central authorities. You can't have your cake and eat it. You can't say, we want high degree of autonomy, and you stand aside. That would be de facto independence of Hong Kong. Hong Kong cannot decide on its own because we are not a sovereign state. We did not become a sovereign state at the end of British rule. Instead, we were returned to China.
But how should we deal with this article?
Ignore it for the purpose of 2047.
It's the basic.
The 1st of July 2047 is a non-event. Authorities in Beijing have said it.
Other than create a more stable political environment, China also can integrate Hong Kong with the mainland as a gateway to access the trade, investment, and international finance. The government also promotes more Chinese national identity through education, media, and cultural programs. By reducing reliance on Western-style governance and legal systems, Beijing moves Hong Kong closer to the mainland's governance model. On the other hand, those residents who are disappointed on the government emigrate to other countries, especially young professionals, emigrated to countries like the UK, Canada, and Australia under special visa schemes introduced. Since 2020, over 140,000 people have left the city, with the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia being popular destinations. Hong Kong experienced several times of mass emigration wave. Usually it relates to mainland. These include 1967 leftist riots, 1989 Tiananmen crackdown, 1980s when China and British signed Sino-British Joint Declaration, before handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997, and latest is after introduced of national security laws in 2019. However, there is statistics shown that 35% of the people return to the city since they emigrate to other countries since 1980s. While Hong Kong remains a major financial hub, some international businesses expressed concerns about the loss of freedoms and the rule of law. However, Beijing has sought to reassure investors and integrate Hong Kong into the Greater Bay Area Economic Zone. While Hong Kong grapples with the loss of talent, Beijing has responded by encouraging an influx of mainland Chinese professionals. Programs like the Top Talent Pass Scheme, TTPS, have attracted well-educated mainlanders, who now dominate new immigration. From 2022 to 2023, Hong Kong's population saw a 2.1% increase due to net immigration, with 95% of TTPS participants hailing from mainland China. This demographic shift is reshaping the city's cultural and political landscape, aligning it more closely with the mainland. The events in Hong Kong became a symbol of China's tightening control and influenced global perceptions of China's policies, especially in Taiwan, where fears of Beijing's ambitions have intensified. Before we end the topic, let me share with you the speech given by the Singapore founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in Hong Kong University in 1992. He has different view on the democracy, and even says democracy brings regression.
It has been a disappointing exercise. I remember as a student in Britain being taught constitutional law by a very distinguished professor who had been one of Churchill's cabinet secretaries. And he illustrated with the example of Ceylon how the ideal transition to democracy and self-government would take place. They had their first municipal elections in 1932 for mayor of Colombo and a council for Colombo. They had two universities. They had a thick layer of professionals and administrative officers. They had large sterling balances. So they started off with all the advantages that would ensure progress and prosperity. Of course, I was taught this in 1947, when Ceylon had just got independence. And India, of course, had just gone into turmoil with the breakup of Pakistan and India. I have never believed that democracy brings progress. I know it to have brought regression. I watch it year by year, every 2 years when I meet my fellow members of the leaders of the Commonwealth. And it need not have been thus. The British never governed these countries by one man, one vote. It was one British government, one British resident, and his word was law. And he had good district officers whose word was also law for that district. The conclusion that no ingenious democratic system of one man, one vote can ever bridge the divide between a majority Sinhalese population of about 14 to 16 million, whose intention is to dominate and to bring down some 2 million Tamils in Jaffna to their level. And Jaffna Tamils have a tradition, being the better educated, being the administrators, being the judges, being the professionals. And that this breakup into warfare was inevitable. It was a feudal society where the landlord controlled the votes of illiterate peasants. It was a divided society, although they were all Muslims. And sure enough, it's fallen apart. So, I think regardless of the present missionary zeal of the Americans of democracy and human rights, which has broken up the Soviet Union, it would be misguided to believe that what has worked in very special circumstances amongst European societies and what is barely working in Korea and Taiwan is universally valid. How to establish good government? Good government means a government that considers itself a trustee of the people, whether you're king, chief, or whatever. Not somebody in temporary charge and insecure and therefore out to settle an annuity and a nest egg for yourself, which is what has happened in so many countries. So if you ask me what my thoughts on decolonization are, I think they are grim, because Western political scientists have not lived in these societies, have not understood that what is required is economic progress, development, and the final blossoming of a large educated middle class, which alone can sustain a democracy. When you have 60 to 70% of your population educated, knowing what will work and what will not work, then one man, one vote makes sense. Why give way on Hong Kong to the British, who do not have either military or economic club to hurt me? Then I'm inviting trouble from from Bill Clinton. Chris Patton can only express his exasperation, but Bill Clinton can turn MFN off. Hong Kong deserves democracy, but alas, in the world as it is, we do not often get what we deserve.
Lee Kuan Yew's speech sparks a hot debate topic whether democracy is really applicable and bring progression for all countries. What do you think? In future, we could see a new model of development in Hong Kong under support from the mainland. Anyway, we hope that Hong Kong will remain its status as the Pearl of the Orient, be more prosperous and better in the future.